I'll go ahead and kick it off this afternoon. So today we've got Peter Cozzens, and I'm excited for Peter being on here because a lot of the times we're talking about more present day stuff, present even being World War II era, which we just had a retired Major General on yesterday. Actually, it was pretty exciting. But today we're talking more about really American history, the genesis of American history time frame is where I like to put it, and it's November. It's Native American Heritage Month, and I'm from I'm from Southern Ohio, where there's a man named Tecumseh, who I grew up knowing him my whole life really as a leader, as someone to look up to emulate. He's a hero in the area where I'm, and of course it's the white people who settled it, and essentially he was born in Chillicothe too, so was I, but he has the Shawnee and Tecumseh in particular have such a great heritage and history in the region of the country where I'm from. And I also know, and there's so many to me, Tecumseh is a person who, there are some people I believe that would be who they are no matter what era they're in. So I think Ben Franklin would have been Ben Franklin. He didn't need that revolution, that 1700 time frame. I think he would have been Ben Franklin. I think Leonardo da Vinci would have been Leonardo da Vinci. Bill Gates, probably a product of the times. I would put Tecumseh myself in the Ben Franklin category. I think he could have been born today and he's going to be successful. I think I don't think he was a product of the times. I think he's a very special person. And I think there's a lot to glean that we can learn from him as a diplomat, as a leader, as someone that's inspiring and encouraged, of course. Integrity. I think he had a lot of those attributes that very admirable. And I think it's also a special time in the founding of our country from a history standpoint. So just having you on to be able to talk about this, I think it's really exciting. And the reason we want to bring Peter on is because Peter is many reasons there too. Number one, just reading about you've written 17 books on the Civil War itself, which is pretty awesome. Which Preston and I are already talking about some of that sort of stuff because we're still pretty amateurs when it comes to Civil War. There's a lot to learn there. It's one of those things, kind of like Vietnam, as you think you know it, and then you just keep learning more. But also what's pretty cool for Preston and I, is Peter's a former Army officer. He's a captain and a retired Foreign Service officer. So, before we really start digging into Tecumseh and the things that he did in this era of the founding of America, tell us a little bit about your Army career, like your background there, how you got started, and then the transition to Foreign Service officer and what that looked like.
Well, I went through college on an ROTC scholarship, so I had a 4-year regular Army active duty obligation afterward. And I took the Foreign Service test, which is a test. The Foreign Service is a career diplomatic service of the United States. And I took the Foreign Service test kind of on a lark as a senior in college, and I actually passed it. And the Foreign Service held me on the register during the time I was in the Army. So as I approached the end of my 4-year active commitment, I had to make a decision whether to resign from the regular Army and go in the Foreign Service or continue in the Army. And I opted for the Foreign Service. Still not sure if that was the right decision, actually. I enjoyed the Foreign Service, but I think I would have enjoyed an Army career even more. I retired from the Foreign Service with the equivalent. The Foreign Service is unique in the federal service in that, like the military, you have rank in person, not rank in position like the civil service does. So I retired the equivalent of a brigadier general from the Foreign Service in 2012, as early as I could, because I wanted to devote myself entirely to writing, and I had a lot of ideas. And I was branch military intelligence, but I spent most of my 4 years as S2 of a cavalry squadron. And I think if I'd stayed in, I may very well have requested a branch transfer to armor. But the military is still very much a part of me. I belong to the Army and Navy Club here in Washington, D.C.
Nice.
And I still identify more with those 4 years in some ways than I do with my 30-year career in the Foreign Service, for whatever reason.
Did you do any writing? Did you do any writing while you were still in uniform, or was it just maybe?
I started to research. I began researching my first book during my last year in the Army, and I wrote it during my first tour in the Foreign Service. And it was a book called No Better Place to Die, The Battle of Stones River, about an important but overlooked battle in the Western theater of the Civil War. And I got it kind of in the back door in terms of being published. And the book was a History Book Club bestseller, and back when the History Book Club meant something, and a Book of the Month Club selection, and did real well. And I continued writing all throughout my Foreign Service career, and to the point where the Foreign Service became a day gig, a way of paying the bills and giving me a salary and a future pension. But writing was always, I knew be my avocation, my true love. And so now that I'm retired, I can exercise that to the fullest.
So I'm in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and didn't know much about Stones River before we moved here. Really?
You're in Murfreesboro?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just down the road.
I hope you visited the battlefield.
We have couple walks through,
okay.
but it's it's a mixture here, as I'm sure you know. It's not quite like a Shiloh where it's pretty well untouched. You're walking through areas that have been built up and changed. So
I know.
It's hard to get that full picture.
I know, and in fact, a good part of the first day's action, initial Confederate charge, is broken up by the highway, and yeah, it's hard to get and I think there used to be a drive-in theater, if I recall correctly, where part of the ultimate charge of the battle occurred. And yeah, it's very broken up, unfortunately. Not like Shiloh or Chickamauga.
Did you grow up real infatuated with the Civil War as a kid?
Yeah, I did. As a kid, I was reading Civil War books and playing with the H.O. Scales soldiers that were real popular then. And I must have had like 2,000 of those. And I tried to recreate Civil War battles using maps. And so that was in my blood from my childhood.
I think it makes the writing easier. I mean, especially because you were working full time in a legit field. You weren't just flipping burgers.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, I'm sure it took a lot of mental and physical energy. You save for the paycheck, but there's no way you get to that level without putting the time in. And it's got to be it's an interesting profession to me. That a career in the military, every career for one is interesting, right? Because they're all different. But I would think Foreign Service officer is that same sort of sleeve of it's just different. I think
it's a tremendous intensity to it, particularly when you're posted abroad and when you're in a dangerous country, as I was in Peru. I was there during the Shining Path terrorism and was caught up in a terrorist attack myself. And I mean, I was everywhere from visiting Contra camps in the Nicaraguan Honduran border early in my career to, again, the Contras, to being consul general in Panama when we closed our military bases down and gave the Panamanians the canal. And it's not a 9-to-5 job either. I mean,
right.
When crises occur, just like in the military, you're 24/7.
Mm-hmm. And I'm sure it's one of the, just like the military, they give you those roles that are, you probably, like in the civilian world, probably, I'm air quoting here, too young for, right? But they step you up and you're forced to step up. I think that's also the beauty of the military. Is it's pretty amazing what some not as qualified, again, I'm air quoting, people can accomplish when given the task.
Right. And what was interesting and little known about the Foreign Service, at least until I'll say the Iraq War itself, not Desert Storm, but the actual Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan, until they occurred, we were losing a higher number of people killed in the Foreign Service than, relatively speaking, than in the military through terrorist acts and things of that nature.
Never would have thought that, but I can see. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've been asked this 100 times over. Is there ever going to be a book about your Foreign Service experience?
No, I've got too many other ideas, and I really have kind of put that behind me. I don't really. That's a closed chapter.
Gotcha.
Yeah. No, I get it. Well, I think that brings us here to what brought you to the passion, especially working full time and cranking out writing. It's commendable. Writing is, I think it's a difficult task. Reading is one thing, but putting it on paper is a whole other level. And that sounds pretty natural with the Civil War stuff, but what brought you to Tecumseh? I know that this isn't the book in particular. Yeah, I should mention Tecumseh and the Prophet. It came out last October. Is that right? October 2020.
In hardback, right?
And so it's pretty recent. It's still a pretty recent book. You've got a giant catalog of the Civil War stuff, but what made you move to sort of this other topic that?
Well, you're kind of missing an important book in between the Civil War and Tecumseh and the Prophet, and that is my book that came out in 2016, The Earth is Weeping, the epic story of Indian Wars for the American West, which was a international bestseller and garnished a number of awards, including the Gilder Lehrman Prize for the best book in military history published in English the year it came out. And so that was my first step away from the Civil War. When I retired from the Foreign Service, I wanted to write a really big book for a really big publisher. Unfortunately, I was able to do both and secure Knopf as my publisher. And when I was casting about for a topic, I realized there hadn't been a major book on the Indian Wars writ large published by a New York trade publisher in over 40 years, since Burying My Heart at Wounded Knee, which of course was a bestseller, but it was a product of its time. And it had a lot of biases in it, and it had a lot of errors, both of fact and interpretation in it. And I wanted to try to tell an objective story of Indian Wars in the American West. When I completed that, I thought about it, and I realized, wait a minute, a lot occurred before the Indian Wars of what I call popular imagination, Indian Wars in the West. You know, the young American Republic first had to overcome the Indians who lived in the Midwest and in the American South. And so that's what caused me to turn to Tecumseh and his brother Tecumseh, the Shawnee Prophet, because they epitomize the last great Indian resistance in the Midwest, which also happened. Their alliance also happens to have been the greatest in terms of both its the diversity, the number of tribes that were involved, and the sheer number of warriors. It was the largest pan-Indian alliance the United States ever confronted. I mean, in any time in our history. And had Tecumseh and his brother prevailed, and if you read the book, you'll see there are opportunities where they might have prevailed in their alliance with the British during the War of 1812 against the United States. The map of the United States could have been quite different, particularly the northern Midwest. And at a minimum, settlement of the American West, I think, would have been delayed by a generation, maybe two. And so those conflicts were extraordinarily important. And Tecumseh and the Prophet then becomes not only the story of these two fascinating brothers, one Tecumseh, arguably the most important Indian political and military leader, and his brother, without a doubt, the most important Indian prophet or seer, and prophets were an important part of the Indian culture and Indian belief. And so that story really had to be told to put The Earth is Weeping in context. So in a sense, Tecumseh and the Prophet is a prequel to The Earth is Weeping. I kind of wrote them, as we say in the military, kind of ass backwards, but so be it.
Well, I think it's great though, and I agree with everything you're saying, and we'll get into it. But and I think it's also, I think from an American history standpoint, it makes sense that you wrote the earlier book about the West, because I do think just my impression, general American history concepts of who we know, who are the players. We do think Sitting Bull, and we think Crazy Horse, and Geronimo, and those sort of names. And like I said, regionally we know Tecumseh, but I'm not certain if someone from California or New York might know who Tecumseh was,
Right.
and the Shawnee at all.
And then you should, and I mean, it just, you mentioned Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, their alliance with the Cheyenne in 1866 that caused a very bad day for Custer and the 7th Cavalry. I mean, that was the high watermark for Indian alliances in the West, and they only mustered about 2,000 warriors. Their Cheyenne and Dakota alliance. Tecumseh and his brother, at the height of their alliance, had they had over 6,000 warriors at their disposal. So they dwarfed anything that Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse and their Cheyenne allies were able to accomplish. I mean, they should be better known. And 2 points I want to make early on, and before you go on, is we were speaking of Tecumseh. We have to recognize, and this is something that I didn't realize until I got into the research. Initially, I signed a contract to write a biography strictly of Tecumseh. And then as I got into the research, I realized, wait a minute, he's inseparable from his brother. His brother, Tecumseh, who a very unappealing character, unlike Tecumseh, who was really a natural leader. I mean, he was charismatic. He was a natural leader of men, great hunter, great warrior. His brother was absolute ne'er-do-well. He was a dissolute alcoholic at age 18, as so many of the Indians in the Midwest were, unfortunately. And then he had this prophetic vision that transformed him overnight and led to the creation of this social, religious, cultural movement among the tribes in the Midwest. More than a dozen tribes, as far north and west as northwestern Minnesota. And it was that alliance that Tecumseh then was able to transform into a political and military alliance for his own purposes. Again, working kind of symbiotically with his brother. But had it not been for his brother and his initial religious appeal, Tecumseh, I don't think, would have been able to create an alliance from scratch. And secondly, we have to realize too, when we mentioned the Shawnee, interestingly, the Shawnee, I'd say 90% of the Shawnee living east of the Mississippi River at the time of which we're speaking, the turn of the 19th century, they rejected Tecumseh's messages. And the bulk of their alliance was drawn from other tribes, again, both near and far, which in a way really, it speaks to the power of both their messages and to their charisma, that they were able to draw tribes from so far away. So it was a much more than a Shawnee. It was a pan-Indian movement among nearly all the tribes in the Midwest and the Great Lakes region at the time.
Which was, I say we set the scene on where we are in context of history, right? American history itself, because we're talking Midwest, but really we're talking about Revolutionary War time frame, right? And then the early foundings of the empire, or the republic, not empire.
Through the War of 1812, right? Actually, my book goes back to the roots of it all, back even before the French and Indian Wars.
Exactly. But when we say Great Lakes and Midwest, really what we're talking about is the frontier.
That was the frontier. In fact, that's why, my book, I was pleased that it won the Western Writers Association of America's what they call the Spur Award for Best Book, and that they recognize that too, that the frontier is whatever it was at that particular time in history. And in the turn of the 19th century, the frontier was Ohio and the Ohio Valley and Eastern Indiana. The Western frontier varied greatly throughout our history.
Can you explain that settlement then? What did it look like? Because, can you just set the scene in the Revolutionary War? Because we have people in New England and sort of that region fighting, and obviously into the South, but it's East Coast. But it doesn't mean every single able-bodied male was fighting the Redcoats. Can you sort of explain what that looked like, the settlement from sort of Pittsburgh, and then you got Kentucky, how that fits in, and of course crossing the Ohio.
Right. During the Revolutionary War, Kentucky was not yet a state, but well, there were no states, but Kentucky Territory, which pretty much encompassed all of modern day Kentucky, as well as portions of West Virginia. It was settled kind of in a patchwork of fortified settlements, of which Daniel Boonesborough was the most famous, but there were others as well. And there were a few isolated settlements north of the Ohio River, but the bulk of the settlement was in Kentucky, which the Shawnee and in particular considered not to be homeland. They didn't reside there, but they considered it to be their primary hunting grounds. And they and the other tribes in the Midwest became caught up in the Revolution, largely through their desire to expel white settlers from Kentucky, from their hunting grounds. And so they formed an alliance with the British and with American Tories. They and after after Yorktown, after the war petered out east of the Appalachian Mountains, it continued with even greater violence in Kentucky and southern Ohio, for a couple of years longer. So initially that was a theater of conflict, and then with the end of the Revolutionary War, you had white settlers pouring in to the southern Ohio Valley. The Ohio River was the natural path of settlement west of the Appalachians. I mean, you had kind of a pressure cooker population-wise east of the Appalachians, and Thomas Jefferson realized that. He believed that to sustain his ideal of a yeoman farmers republic, he had to promote settlement west of the Ohio, west of the Appalachians, and east of Mississippi. And to do that, he had to essentially swindle the Indians out of their land. Mm-hmm. So that led to conflicts in the 1790s, and ultimately the defeat of Indian alliance in the 1790s, and then subsequently through increased pressure on remaining Indian land in the Midwest, you had the growth of Tecumseh's alliance to try to save something as a homeland for the American Indians north of the Ohio River and east of Mississippi.
And pre-revolution, obviously the Native Americans were here before any of the whites, of course. But pre-revolution, it just seems like they've got the land, sort of the territory, but at the same time, they just keep getting stuck in between the British and the French, and then sort of trying to pick, because obviously the whites have the technology, mm-hmm. And it's just a matter of sort of just picking sides. Some go on one side, go on the other, but it's like you got to hedge your bet because you've got these two powers going at it, and it's hard to tell who's going to be the winner.
Exactly, and some of the tribes bounced back and forth. Kind of went with the fortunes of war, so to speak. But I mean, the French were never really a threat to the American Indians because the French just wanted to trade. They weren't interested in long-term settlements, in raising the forest and creating great agricultural communities. The British were the greater threat in that way. But the British actually, after the French Indian Wars, I mean, the British Treasury was so badly strained by that war, by the concomitant wars on the European continent, that they were content to have forts kind of sprinkled throughout the Midwest and to have a trading presence. And the British government actually prohibited white colonists from settling west of the Appalachians. And that prohibition was actually one of the principal causes of the American Revolution. It's not recognized as much as it should be, but the anger that created among both the landed aristocracy, like the George Washingtons, who wanted to kind of dabble in Western land speculation, as well as potential settlers, was one of the pressure points that led to the Revolutionary War. But the American Indians in the Midwest, really, the threat from the British presence wasn't that great. What they resented was the fact that the British, unlike the French, the British stopped giving them gifts. stopped supplying them free weapons, free, other free goods in exchange for their loyalty.
Why did the British prohibit settlement west? Was that an agreement with the Native Americans?
No, it was really self-interest. Again, like I said, the British Treasury was badly strained. They didn't have a lot of military forces available for service on the North American continent. They'd just taken Canada from the French, so they had to garrison Canada. They realized that if colonial settlers would provoke a major war in the Midwest, they didn't have the troops to guarantee victory. And that was demonstrated pretty clearly when Chief Pontiac in 1765 led an uprising of various tribes, not as large as the subsequent alliance of Tecumseh, but large enough to wipe out all of British forts in the Midwest, excepting Detroit and the Fort Pitt in what is now Pittsburgh, and one other post that name which escapes me now. But they really did a number on the British, and the British eventually were able to subdue Pontiac partly through treaties, and they did realize they just could not, going forward from 1760s, they could not afford another conflict with the Indians.
That's crazy.
Well, that is the difference. It seems like the British had that pompous arrogance, and that's why they kept getting whooped, versus the French attitude, which is more assimilation and pacification to keep them happy, so that the French can come and go as they please. Because that,
right,
the
French presence was very light. It was a very light footprint. Yeah.
But still, alliances and broken alliances with whites, right? And interactions with whites are commonplace. Maybe that's kind of the point of it also, that they're not,
right.
There's lines in the sand where some people agree, and there's lines in the sands where people don't tend to care about. And I'm reading a book right now, about halfway through it. So I'm not finished yet, but it did make me think about like contemporary times, because, and I'm skipping forward a little bit here, but this is when Jefferson was president. And it seems like they're putting essentially an order out, a federal order saying, hey, don't cross into certain areas. There's a federal treaty. It's the Shawnee land. And you just got frontiersmen and pioneers saying, I don't care. I'm just going to do whatever I want. Don't tread on me, stop me. And then the same thing with Native Americans too, you've got warriors and young people trying to make a name for themselves, and that's going to cause clashes. So it's like you've got big government, essentially, the chiefs, and you've got the actual government making rules. But then you've also got people that it's the frontier. It is the Wild West at the time, and people are just kind of doing what they want. And it's through violent means, of course.
Yeah, but I think I don't want to exaggerate that. I think by and large there was a treaty negotiated in 1795, the Treaty of Greenville, that established the border between the Indians, the Indian land, and what is now the state of Ohio, and that border held pretty well for a number of years. It held pretty well. Neither side really crossed it in any great degree, and William Henry Harrison, who was the governor general of what's then called the Northwest Territory, which today is pretty much all the Midwest, it was not until 1803 when he was given orders by Jefferson to get more land, to negotiate treaties with the Indians by hook or by crook, that there was a push to acquire lands beyond that which had been agreed upon in the Treaty of Greenville. And so you had the southern third of Indiana being gobbled up by treaty. Again, these are treaties that were negotiated oftentimes with chiefs who had tribes who had very little claim to the land, oftentimes after getting the signatories completely drunk on liquor. He also, got most of Illinois, at least on paper, and even with these pushes, the Indians showed a tremendous amount of restraint. And when Tecumseh and his brother came on the scene, the American Indians had already lost most of Ohio. They held the northern 2/3 of Indiana. They still had Wisconsin and Minnesota, and if not on paper, at least in fact, the northern half of Illinois. And Tecumseh was willing to abide by those treaties that were negotiated subsequent to the 1795 Treaty of Greenville. But his point was, look, we can't. There was going to be a line in the sand. That was no more treaties after 1805, which was the last treaty Harrison negotiated. And his appeal to other tribes was, look, we have to come together. These are common lands. We are one people. It's like one spoon dipping into one bowl. We have to hold together. And he was willing to accept the land that had been lost, but he was not going to tolerate any further encroachment. And it was not till 1809 when Harrison, in the greatly diminished role as governor of Indiana Territory, he had his domain kind of slashed away because Ohio became a state, and Illinois became a separate territory, Michigan became a separate territory, and so Harrison kind of saw his political future kind of shrinking, and he felt he needed success personally, so he negotiated a pretty bogus treaty in 1809 that sliced away more Indian land in Indiana. And that was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back for Tecumseh, and led to more tribes joining his alliance. But even then, Tecumseh did not provoke war. He realized that without British assistance, he couldn't do anything. I mean, he just didn't have the manpower. Even with several thousand warriors, he could not resist the combined strength of the United States Army and militia. But when the War of 1812 broke out, that was the opportunity. I mean, ally themselves with the British and hope that with British strength and British guarantees, which are made up to the level of the prime minister, that if their Indian allies, were to help them win a war against Americans, that they would in turn guarantee the Indians a pretty substantial homeland in the northern Midwest. That was the great hope that Tecumseh had and fought with.
Was there a popular sentiment? Not fair to group all Indian tribes together,
Right.
but just loosely, did Tecumseh kind of ride that wave to the forefront, or did he kind of create that sense of urgency, if we call it this line in the sand?
It was a combination of both. He really, I would say that of all the American Indians then living in what we know as the Great Lakes area, Midwest, maybe 60 to 70% joined Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa's alliance. The remaining 30-some% preferred to try to assimilate, or had begun to try to assimilate into American society. As these tribes were always semi-agricultural to begin with. They were not wandering tribes like on the Great Plains. So it was not that big a stretch for them to dedicate themselves fully to agriculture. So there were a substantial number of Indians who rejected war with the United States, either because they had begun assimilating or trying to, or they thought it unwinnable even with British assistance. So Tecumseh, he rode a wave, but he made it much greater than it would have been, and he gave it a leadership that his brother could not have. His brother didn't have the military or political acumen that Tecumseh had, and there was no one else who, I think, of the various tribal chiefs, who could have brought together an alliance the way Tecumseh did, and brought us so close to success.
I have a question about that side of the research. I feel like many of us could pick up research on the Civil War. There's dispatches, there's journal entries, there's newspapers. I guess you have to weigh what's accurate, what's not. But how on earth do you dig into the research of like the tribal politics that Tecumseh was dealing with? How is that? How do you get to that?
It's a lot harder in this book than it was in The Earth is Weeping. The Earth is Weeping, I was able to tell a story literally 50-50 from the Indian point of view and from the white point of view, because after the Indian Wars, in the 1890s, and even during the wars, we had Native American leaders who were actually invited to Washington to give testimony before Congress about conflicts. You had Indians talking to newspapermen. Then after the Indian Wars, you had them dictating their recollections to ethnologists, anthropologists, and others. So the sources were, and even like Geronimo he dictated his autobiography. So did Red Cloud. But it was much more difficult. The farther back you go in time, the more difficult it is. I relied on British and Canadian records of Indian agents, government officials. A lot of Tecumseh's talks that he gave were taken down and recorded. A lot of what I got came from whites who had been either captives of Indian tribes or had been adopted into tribes for a good number of years, and then decided to go back to white society maybe after 10, 15, 20 years among the Indians voluntarily. There were a lot of whites who actually preferred living with the Indians than scratching out a living on the frontier. So there were great sources there. Plus, I dove into everything I possibly could in terms of Shawnee and other Eastern woodland, as the tribes in the Midwest were called, Eastern woodland culture and lore and mythology, to try to immerse myself in their worldview and to try to look at things as they would have seen them, not as a 21st century white American imposing our norms on the period. And Tecumseh himself, later in life, dictated memoirs and stories of Shawnee culture, Shawnee life himself to the secretary of the governor of Michigan. They became good friends actually in later years. And so there were enough sources, fortunately, particularly after Tecumseh came into his own, to really tell the story with confidence. The farther back at Tecumseh's life I go, the harder it is to be 100% confident. But there still were enough good sources that I was able to piece together his life with confidence. And again, especially in his childhood years, I drew partly from what a typical Shawnee or young man of other tribes in the area would have experienced at that point in their life, because the tribes of the Midwest were very, very similar. There are very few differences between them culturally or in terms of their religion. And they got along much better and found it easier to ally themselves with one another than the tribes in the Great Plains did. The tribes out there were constantly battling one another for resources, for land, for buffalo. I mean, it was a far different culture.
They shared the space better, it sounds like, with the Eastern Woodland. What are some of the names? Preston, I'm sure he's from Illinois, so he'll recognize a lot of them, but
right.
Not everybody will probably know exactly who you're talking
I'm from Illinois too. I'm from the Chicago suburbs. So Ottawa, Potawatomi, the Chippewa, or the Ojibwa as they were then called, the Miami, which have since actually pretty much disappeared as a tribe. Those were the principal tribes. Let's say Potawatomi, Ojibwa, Ottawa, the Winnebago. A lot of these names are names of cars and campers now.
Noticing that.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we saved the West ones for helicopters.
Right.
But so let's now talk. So I know you keep mentioning the War of 1812. We've got sounds like that first demarcation, that DMZ being 1895 or 1795.
1795.
Do you know? I think, me personally, I think a big part of this also is we as a government promised a lot of Revolutionary War veterans land.
Yeah.
Because back then, I think it is important to know about all of this. In this era, wealth was attributed to land.
The government couldn't have, you're right, they couldn't afford to pay the veterans in money, so they paid them in land. They paid them in Western land, yeah.
But they were honoring, they made the promise before the treaty was written. right?
Yeah, exactly. And fortunately, by the time the hostilities ended in the 1790s, and part of those hostilities, this Indian alliance that predated Tecumseh, and he actually fought with this alliance as a young man, as a young war leader in his 20s. Then in 1791, there's this Indian alliance on which he partly modeled his own, beat the Americans in a battle that actually doesn't have a name. It's best known as St. Clair's defeat in 1791. And the Indian Alliance at that time, at this battle in northeastern, in western Ohio, St. Clair's defeat, they wiped out almost the entire United States regular army, which granted was only about 1,200 men at the time, but they slaughtered. I mean, they killed or wounded about 800 soldiers at minimal loss to themselves. I mean, they just decimated the army. It took almost 3 years for the army to rebuild itself enough to challenge the Indians again.
Peter, how can there be a battle with no name? I thought at this point we could just slap something on it after the fact.
I think the army. I think the government didn't want to give it a name. It was not something to be proud of. So
forget about that one.
Literally, the battle with no name. It's called St. Clair's defeat because the commander was Arthur St. Clair. It was pretty bad. It was the worst defeat the army ever sustained at the hands of a native enemy.
Maybe there might be something to that, really. I mean, I'd like to think that there was, I don't know, I guess I don't know the reason for it, but it doesn't sound shocking that maybe it was, let's leave that one out for now.
It's kind of like Islandoaha in the Zulu War when the whole 24th British foot got wiped out, partly due to their arrogance, thinking it would be easy to defeat a savage, so to speak, enemy. They learned
that's St.
otherwise.
Clair. That's St. Clair right there.
Yeah.
And it is important. Think about it though, in the context of things, you think it is a big deal. You would think it is a big deal, at least in American military history, because that's over 1,000 uniformed regulars.
It's a big deal.
Brand new country that finally have the keys. I think that's also a part of this. We finally have the keys. We don't have to listen. The British is appeasement. British have to appease the French. They have to appease the Native Americans. And then they have to appease the American colonists. They're not even Americans yet. They're just the British colonists. And they're just trying to keep all these people happy from the whole ocean away. Right. And now the Americans have the keys and they're promising land that is wealth. And now they want it.
Yeah.
But so I did want to talk about, so we know Tecumseh and Tuscanawa, they are they're brothers. They've both lived through the ups and downs of geopolitics at the tip of the spear of world politics, with in between these empires of the French and the English, and then the new republic itself, the brand new government of the Americans. They've been in battle on both sides. They've seen the treaties break. See how those promises go. So you mentioned how now we're in the early 1800s, not quite to the War of 1812 yet, and Tecumseh's already he's a tribal chief at this point, right?
Not a tribal. No, he was never a chief of consequence among the Shawnee. We have to keep that in mind. Only about 10% of the Shawnee, paid their allegiance to Tecumseh.
So he was a village chief.
He was a village leader among the Shawnee initially, of a rather small village. He owed his support to, again, building on Tenswatawa's religious and spiritual revivalist alliance, and he owed his leadership to the voluntary adherence of war leaders, political leaders, and their warriors from other tribes. That's one of the things that makes it so remarkable. Not like, unlike Sitting Bull, his base was the Hunkpapa tribe of the Lakota or Sioux nation. And his basis for it was one tribe within the Lakota Nation. Crazy Horses was from the Oglala, one tribe within the Lakota Nation. Tecumseh drew adherents from a multitude of tribes. That's one of the things that makes him much more remarkable than Sitting Bull or Crazy Horse.
Your correction there, Peter, on the use of chief makes me realize that I have probably used that term far too broadly. That's a very, very specific thing.
It is.
Okay.
It's somebody, in most tribes, it's somebody who's elected by a council of elders based on their war record. It's family ties vary from tribe to tribe. It's a title that we have to use with more caution than we do, actually, if we want to be historically accurate.
Yeah, that's a good point, to not assume anything. And you're right, you are right, because it does make the story more impactful, and especially because it wasn't just the Shawnee. So yeah,
Right,
can you kind of describe the state of Indian affairs at this 1800 time, when we have calls for domestic, like settlement, with just pick up the plow, right? Just live here, pick up the plow. I know that was an option that was the U.S. wanted them to take in a lot of ways. But you have alcohol, you've got broken promises. They're getting screwed over by everyone that shakes their hand on, even other tribes, screwing them over with all sorts of things like that. I know. I just want to say, like, I thought it was interesting reading about how, like, an Iroquois tribe in New York would sign away Shawnee land in Ohio. Say, yeah, sure, pay us. You guys can have it.
Right.
And then the whites have the paper when they show up and cross the Ohio. See, guys, we're good. You guys are all the same, aren't you? You got some, that was sort of the attitude, and we got this little flimsy piece of paper. So what was this call to, not even a call to arms, as I understand it, just the call itself to revitalize the culture?
Well, it was, again, before Tecumseh had his visionary transformation in 1805, and came forth with this doctrine of religious and cultural renewal, which essentially was to reject Americans and their goods, especially alcohol, which was just decimating Indian villages. Reject them, reject their way of life. That was a call, though, not for war. It was a call for the Indians to recognize that that, in a sense, that they were partly responsible for what had befallen them. Tecumseh made this clear. We're partly responsible for it. We have strayed from the path that the Great Spirit set down for us and accepted too much of the white man's way of life. We have to return to a pure way of life. And then the Great Spirit will, restock the lands with deer, and the whites somehow will miraculously at some point vanish from our lands. And then again, Tecumseh subsequently building on this to a more muscular political military alliance of tribes, not to make war or reconquer lost land, but to hold what they had, draw the line in the sand and say, from this point forward, from the northern 2/3 of Indiana, the northernmost portion of Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, we're not going to yield any more ground, and we're going to fight together as one. We're going to recognize that we are one people, and not disparate tribes. That was his message. And again, his alliance did not provoke war. The war was initially brought to them in 1811. It's a whole nother story, but William Henry Harrison attacked Tecumseh and his brother's headquarter village at Tippecanoe, Indiana. Tecumseh was off on a journey through the South, trying to recruit Southern tribes, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, and the Creek, to join in his alliance to make common cause in resisting white encroachment, because that was occurring in the South, just as it was north of the Ohio. And while he was away, Harrison decided, I'll take advantage of his absence and I'll strike Tippecanoe and wipe that village off the map. And while Tecumseh's away, recognizing that Tecumseh was a far inferior war leader than Tecumseh. And he won that battle, but ultimately cost him more than gain, because it led to even greater number of Indians coming into the alliance, because they recognized that, you couldn't trust the Americans. I mean, they would even cross onto Indian land to attack us. But the Indians never provoked anything. When the War of 1812 broke out, Tecumseh saw an opportunity, the best opportunity he had, and despite British betrayals in the past, which is, again, that's the whole other part of the book, he realized that his best hope lay in an alliance with the British, and that the British and the Indians combined could not only hold the ground that the Indians wanted to hold, but also possibly roll back the white frontier. And they came very close to doing so, as the reader will see in the course of the book. And the white, they defeated the principal American army in the Midwest at the Battle of Detroit, captured the entire American army. Tecumseh and his British allies, they held the state of what is now Michigan for over a year. They made inroads in northern Ohio, and I really think that that given the complete ineptitude of relatively speaking, of American leadership in the War of 1812, and the fact that American resources were diverted to the fighting in the east, along the St. Lawrence River and eastern Ontario, and then even farther east than that. And of course, then when the British attacked along the Atlantic coast and ultimately the Gulf Coast, that if the British had had the manpower necessary, if they'd have had maybe even just 2 or 3 more regiments to throw into the mix, to throw into the fighting with Tecumseh and the Indians, I have no doubt whatsoever that they would have prevailed. But there was a fellow named Napoleon Bonaparte in Europe who was causing the British to divert most of their military resources to the continent. And by the time Napoleon was defeated, it was too late for the British to really get enough reinforcements over to make any difference when it came to the fighting in the Midwest. I mean, that was decided by then. Tecumseh was dead, and it was a done deal. They sent enough troops over to raise hell along the Atlantic coast, burn Washington, D.C., almost achieved victory in the Gulf Coast, the Battle of New Orleans, but it was too late for Tecumseh. But had it not been for the Napoleonic Wars, I have no doubt that the British and their Indian allies would have prevailed, that Tecumseh would have been granted his buffer state because it was in the British interest. Because the Americans in the Midwest, especially Kentuckians and Tennesseans, they wanted Canada. I mean, they wanted Canada. They wanted that land. It was Canadian land fever that was one of the causes of war. And so it was in the British interest to have a native buffer state between the United States and Canada. So I have no doubt that the British would have prevailed, and that at least for a generation or two, the Native Americans would have had their buffer state. And what would that have meant for the development of the United States? Who can say how the Upper Midwest would have unfolded? But undoubtedly, it would have delayed settlement of the American West.
Rewrite history real quick there.
It would have rewritten the history and the shape of the United States, and it would have postponed things in the West considerably. And again, if you want to even go farther into what ifs, what if there'd been no state of Michigan, no state of Wisconsin to provide troops to the federal army? Who knows how the Civil War may have gone?
Yeah.
So it's one of those alternative history things that is it's very interesting to ponder, and it was the right time, the right place. Everything I feel like was lined up at this junction with where the Native Americans were, with Canada being there, because I don't think the alliance, even they tried, it wouldn't have happened 100 years prior. And then the ask being, the treaties have already kicked back several times, and it does seem like from my impression, the U.S. was, at least for certain periods of time, accepting of a permanent region of the Native Americans in the Great Lakes region, not just with this.
Right.
It wasn't just necessarily like, yeah, we'll do it for now and we'll just keep pushing them west. I'm sure some people
Right.
may have thought
Yeah.
that, but the way I understand it, it does seem like there was a good faith belief at that time that that would have been an acceptable result.
Yeah, in fact, by the time that Harrison negotiated this 1809 treaty that ultimately led to the Battle of Tippecanoe and all that, I mean, his political enemies in Indiana were writing their associates in Washington, D.C. that, hey, this is unnecessary. Harrison's doing this for his own political aggrandizement. The Tecumseh and his brother aren't bothering anybody. They're adhering to existing treaties. This is all nonsense. I mean, the Revolutionary War veterans had all the land they needed. Indiana wasn't, the portion of Indiana that did belong to the whites it wasn't settled by more than about 30,000 people. There wasn't this great need for the land. It was a case of Harrison, again, trying to make Indiana bigger so he could be the governor of a real state and not just a diminished territory.
There we go.
Ego. Let's talk about this alliance. And I know we've mentioned it from a 50,000 foot level, but I mean, when you're thinking Tecumseh, to me at least, I mean, that's what it is. I view him as a modern day special forces officer or a prior special forces officer almost, because this is a guy that spoke multiple languages. He was a tactician. And he's a diplomat in a way to where he could sit and break bread with William Henry Harrison if he needed to, with his English skills, but then also corral and unite the other Native American tribes.
Yeah, he had a lot of American friends. He had a lot of American friends in the frontier too. I mean, personal friends too.
Yeah. So like, can you and we try to keep these at, I know we could talk about Tecumseh forever. And we try to keep these around an hour, but like
Right.
What I would like to get into though is, let's talk about, can you describe the breadth of this alliance that eventually, in tandem, we know Tenskwatawa.
Tenskwatawa. Just call him the Prophet. It's easier.
The Prophet.
Done.
He planted the seeds. And by the way, I didn't even know about his first name until reading your book. I've always known him as that Tenskwatawa name. And that's a real interesting, there's a lot in the book that obviously that if you are interested in this, there's a lot there, especially this whole region. If you're from the Midwest, I really enjoy reading this type of stuff because it's your backyard, the rivers, the towns, all of this stuff. It's just right. It's right here in this region.
And it's a central epic in American history. I mean, that. And
it's the very first mission upon defeating the British. It's like, okay, what do we do now? Well, we got to figure out the West. We got Northwest Territory. We got to figure out. We got Lewis and Clark. There's just lots of different things that we got to do to figure out now that we have the keys. And this is a big part of it. So with them pushing out west and promising land that they don't have, what did this actual alliance look like with Tecumseh, with the seeds planted from his brother, the Prophet? What are we talking about?
At its apex, again, its apex in early 1813, it encompassed warriors and their own war leaders who, again, pledged their loyalty voluntarily to Tecumseh from northern Ohio, from Indiana, from what is today Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, a big chunk of land, and a lot of Indian tribes. I can't remember the exact number now, but it was at least 14 tribes. And an important point to make here is that unlike, the United States Army, United States militia, or the British military, an Indian war leader, be he Tecumseh, the leader of the overarching alliance, or the war leader or war chief of a particular tribe, the allegiance that was paid to them by their subordinates, by the rank and file warriors, was voluntary. There were no institutional mechanisms in place that a war leader, a war chief could draw on to compel anyone who was subordinate to him to do anything that he asked. I mean, it was all a matter of his personal charisma, his personal war record. It was voluntary. I mean, nobody had to follow a war chief or a war leader on any level. Any Indian warrior could say, screw this, I'm going home. And even someone as lofty as Tecumseh could do nothing to stop that. So that's a very important point to note, that they had this alliance of more than a dozen tribes and some 6,000 warriors, but they were all allied to him voluntarily. They had prestigious leaders of their own, like the Potawatomi leader named Monpok, or there's another chief named Roundhead. There were a number of these other war chiefs who were, bona fide leaders of their own tribes, who subordinated themselves voluntarily to Tecumseh's leadership. So it was all voluntary, and that's something that U.S. generals or British generals obviously never had to deal with. And then saying, okay, you go ahead, we're going home.
Right.
Today.
And again, not from the tribe. It's not like they have those tribal relations.
And language,
right? I mean, it's earned.
There were a number of different languages at play. They would often have to communicate through sign language, using tribal interpreters to translate from Shawnee to Potawatomi, or use English in some cases. I mean, they had a multitude of challenges that they faced, and including feeding their families. The Indians could not make war year round. They had their wives and children to think about. They had their villages to protect, because a good portion of their food came from agriculture, and they had to go on the seasonal hunts. So they had all these other factors at play that neither the Americans nor the British had to contend with. So they had a multitude of challenges, and where to get ammunition and weapons. Right.
And maintain their heritage at the same time, and because that's part of their code at this time, is to reject the white technology.
That's right.
And
Tanks Fatawa said reject everything American, but the British are okay, and rifles and ammunition are okay.
Yeah.
I like it.
The one story I want to mention, because I always love this story, I'm halfway through the book, so I haven't read the whole thing. Do you remember if you write about the sticks? The bundle of the sticks
right.
in Tecumseh. Can you tell that? Because I love that story of how he was able to really, again, cross language barriers and just really get that message across to these. They're at the end of the day, they're tribal, they're paternalistic, they've got grudges, and he is uniting them with this common cause. And I really love the stick analogy, or his story that he used.
Maybe you could remind me of the stick story.
It's so.
I'll tell you why I'm asking you to remind me in a second.
The one that this is, by the way, in Chillicothe, Ohio. There's an outdoor drama called Tecumseh, and it's an Alan Eckert sort of play, but it's really fictionalized. Fun. Yeah, I know, and I know you. I read a lot of Alan Eckert as a kid.
Yeah, it's good. It's good fiction. It's not so good history.
Well, maybe this didn't happen, but I still like it. Just Tecumseh, when people are questioning him, we can't. There's for many reasons we can't defeat the whites, or why would we even join? And he would say, "Here, take this stick." And the guy, the chief of the tribe he's trying to recruit, he said, "Okay, break it." Right. And the guy just simply breaks the stick. Right. And then Tecumseh gives him 6 other sticks, small diameter. Right. Now break them. Right. And you can't break them. It's just they bend, but they don't break. They bend and they. So one individual stick is going to get broken every single time. Yeah. But the more you put together, the stronger the resolve. Right. I don't think that was apocryphal. I think that was true. The reason I asked you that is because right now I'm in the course of working with my editor on my next book, which I'll just give a quick plug for right now. Remember, there were things also going on south of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. And my next book is called Old Hickory and the Red Sticks, Andrew Jackson, the Creek Indians, and the brutal war for the American South. Ooh. And in that book, sticks also play a role. Of course, that's fresh in my mind. Sure. And among the southern tribes, they used, in the villages of the creeks, they would send out bundles of sticks
to tell different villages when to unite for a military campaign. So they send out like a bundle of, say, 40 sticks to each of the villages. And it's like, okay, when you get to the 40th stick, that's the day you leave and come to our rallying point. So that's why you kind of threw me there for the sticks.
Yeah. No, I like it. No, that's a great, it is, we try to keep them to an hour and a little bit over, but it's just, like I said, I know we could keep talking about this all day, but that's exciting. I'm glad that, so if you wrote 17 Civil War, I guess we're gonna have 17 of the frontiersman type books.
But no, you'll have the book that kind of, I think will round out, I call again, an ass backwards trilogy of the wars that the United States fought against the Indians. I mean, you'll have the wars for the Midwest, the wars for the American South, the biggest being the Creek War. I mean, that was extraordinarily important. And which culminated in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, the victory for Andrew Jackson, that if he had not achieved, he would never have even been at New Orleans to fight the British. And then you have the Indian Wars in the West. So I've covered the entire continent. I mean, the Indian Wars in the East were fought when we were still colonists, but in terms of the wars that the United States fought, that would be my trilogy. And then I'm moving on to something entirely different.
That's great. Awesome. I'll be on the lookout for that. The Tecumseh the Prophet is out now. Really, all your books, I think we're real interested in definitely some Civil War stuff too. So
I'd be happy to come back and chat about the Civil War. Well, I find that
Preston will be more involved on those ones. Sorry,
I don't have a photographic memory. I tend to I'll write a book, and then when I'm in the midst of the next book, unfortunately, a certain amount of detail of the previous book sort of dissipates. It's just kind of
probably have to really dive into those details. Yeah,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you can only retain so much, but just thanks for what you're doing. And again, as just a fan of the genre, when you were talking about as a kid with the battles and the Civil War, that's how I was with, wanting to wear the, like the coonskin hat and the tomahawk. That was sort of my era, probably just a product of my times, not times, but really region. Scioto, Paint Creek, Little Miami, Chillicothe. Those are all, that's
right.
where I grew
there
up.
Are a lot of Tecumseh fought a lot of battles against the Kentucky militia as a young man in those areas too. So yeah, you're right in the heart of it.
Exactly, and it's all an American story. All of it is, and these are all real people.
Yep. And we Midwesterners have to make people understand that our story is the American story too. It's a large part of the American story.
Well, and that is to really wrap it up here. That's what it's just. We run into the further we get from it, our memory fades with people that were actually there, of course. But at the same time, as you mentioned already, with Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee and the kind of the Alan Eckert dramatization stuff, where they're exaggerating, there's just so much more information and ease to get research done, I think, now than it was. And so the depth of your footnotes and the diaries and the articles from newspapers and stuff back then to help really paint the picture as it was. We don't know without being there, but that sort of objective analysis of real people doing real things where people live today. It's good work, and we're glad to have it. And I'm really glad you wrote the book, because again, it's just not a popular topic for whatever reason. Yeah. Not everybody knows Tecumseh. They know Crazy Horse. I want them to know Tecumseh.
Yeah, and we got to tell these stories through the perspective and the cultural norms of the time. That's one of my real bugaboos. I don't like historians who impose 21st century values or judgments on history. We got to look at it through the eyes of those who lived it and judge them accordingly, according to the standards of their day. That's what I think, at least.
It's tough. It's a tough thing to do.
And that, sir, is the art of being the writer. So good luck.
Okay. Thanks so much, guys. I had a good time.
Thank you so much, Peter. Hope to talk soon.